Welcome to episode 16 of Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobbie Holmes. We are kicking off the spooky season with my very first paranormal episode. But not just ghosts. There's legend of murder and criminal activity. So a little something for everyone. Today I'm going to tell you about St. Anne's Retreat in Logan, Utah. I know, another Utah story, but it just so happens that there is a lot of freaky, weird stuff that happens around here. St. Anne's is a privately owned retreat in the Cache National Forest. Because it is private, over the years when it has changed ownership, so did the name. It's also known as Hatch's Camp, Forest Hills, and Pine Glen Cove. Just a little bit of history. In 1910, Hezekiah Hatch built the first cabin on the grounds for him and his wife, Georgia. After she died in 1919, their son Lorenzo Hatch and his brother-in-law, Floyd Odlum, began building more cabins on the grounds. Once construction was complete, there were 2 main lodge areas, 6 small cabins, a swimming pool with a pool house, a playhouse for the children, and there was even a small theater with a ticket booth. This was the only retreat in the area with a pool, so for the times it was pretty fancy. It became the place for summer getaways for both the Hatch and the Odlum families. They lived in New York City and were both very wealthy men. The retreat was also used by their acquaintances from New York, Hollywood, and VIP politicians. The retreat stayed as Hatch's Camp until the 1950s when it was donated to the Roman Catholic Church of Salt Lake City. The church changed the name to St. Anne's Retreat. It was also referred to as the Nunnery. The nuns from the Sisters of the Holy Cross used it as a vacation spot, or so they would like us to believe. Here is where the legend begins. Apparently, nuns were sent here to repent if they had sinned, especially if the sin was having sex with priests and monks and becoming pregnant. I didn't realize that was a common thing to happen, but after doing some research, it is. Supposedly, the nuns gave birth to their babies on the retreat and then would drown them in the swimming pool to hide the fact that they had sinned. I hate to break it to them, but the big guy knows. There's another version of this story. The retreat was still used to house pregnant nuns, but the babies were given up for adoption, which sounds more reasonable. One nun decided she wanted to keep her baby, so that night she grabbed him from the nursery and started running through the woods to escape. Not sure where she thought she was going because the nunnery was 10 miles of Cache National Forest between there and civilization. The head nun quickly noticed what she did and was furious. She yelled out that she would kill both her and her baby when she found them. The head nun began chasing after her with a few of the dogs from the grounds. The nun wanted to lead the dogs away from the baby, so she hid him in the bushes and distracted them with loud noises in the opposite direction. When she felt like she was safe, she returned for her baby, but he was gone. She sprinted back to the retreat where she saw her baby floating face down in the pool. While it was the head nun who murdered the baby, she felt so guilty that she caused this baby's death and committed suicide. One story says she ate a handful of poisonous berries. Another account says it was suicide by slitting her own throat. So obviously these aren't credible stories with police reports or documentation. These are legends. But is there any truth to it? Would there be any documentation if the babies were born in secret? You can't have documentation of death if there's no documentation of birth. The thought of nuns killing babies sounds pretty ridiculous though, right? I thought so too, until I started digging deeper and deeper into articles about Catholic nuns. This is not the only instance where I've read of nuns becoming pregnant, kept away from the public through their pregnancy, and given birth in secret, then got rid of the evidence, as in the baby. Some stories are like the one version of the nunnery where the babies are whisked away after birth and put up for adoption. I read of European and Mexican Catholic churches where babies were hidden in the cement walls of tunnels that connected the monasteries. Now, these tunnels definitely do exist, but I can't find anything about any actual remains discovered in the walls. So far, everything I've mentioned is legend. No documented proof. A conspiracy theory that's been talked about for decades. But I stumbled across an article where there was indeed a child grave discovered. It was in Chewam, Ireland. A few boys were fishing in the area and decided to dig up some worms for bait. They lifted up a cement slab and saw that it was hollow underneath. They investigated further and found that this space was packed to the brim with tiny skeletons. Over 800, in fact. That's a lot of pregnant nuns. After the remains of the children were found, the nuns came forward to talk about what life was like at that convent. They were denied any type of drugs or pain medication during their labor. The pain was considered their payment for their sins. Which I'm sure the priests were the ones enforcing that rule, and guess who it was that got them pregnant? All babies born there were cared for in a very small, cramped nursery space. To avoid bringing attention to what was going on, there were no doctors called in. They didn't properly care for the children medically. Disease and infection took over. Children died of infections, measles, dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia, to name a few. Because it was such tight quarters without any medical attention, when one child got sick, it spread like wildfire. Someone dying every day. Most children didn't survive past 1 year of age. These bodies were deposited in a nearby septic tank wrapped in a white cloth. In 1972, the monastery was closed, the tank was sealed off, and the Catholics zipped their lips about the dead children until they were uncovered. I believe conspiracy theories usually stem from some small truth. If nuns were having sex, getting pregnant, and covering up dead children in Chewam, who's to say that wasn't happening in other convents around the world? Back to St. Anne's Retreat. Legend has it that if you go up there, you can hear a nun sobbing, or sometimes babies crying by the pool. One person actually claimed to see ghostly babies floating in the water. Most people report that while walking around the retreat, they will hit random cold spots, even in the middle of July. There is a woman in black that has been spotted around the retreat by many people. She is thought to be the nun that committed suicide on the grounds. The woman in black isn't the only paranormal entity that has been reported by multiple people. There have been sightings of a white beast with red eyes. These creatures are being referred to as Hellhounds. In folklore, a hellhound is an omen. If you stare into their red eyes, something very bad is going to happen, possibly even death. According to Wikipedia, quote, hellhounds are often assigned to guard the entrances to the world of the dead, such as graveyards and burial grounds, or undertake other duties related to the afterlife or the supernatural, such as hunting lost souls. They are said to be the protectors of the supernatural, guarding the secrecy of supernatural creatures or beings from the world, end quote. So that's super creepy. Mental note, never stare into the eyes of a hellhound. In 1993, St. Anne's was sold again. The retreat hasn't been cared for. The pool has been drained and the buildings have deteriorated. At one point, this was a known location where people would meet for satanic worship. That alone is enough reason for me to never want to visit the nunnery. Because of the legends at St. Anne's, most locals in Logan fear it and don't dare go up there. But it is actually frequented by teenagers going up there to try to see the woman in black or hear the babies crying. It is a common thing for people to venture out to haunted areas to try to experience the paranormal. Well, apparently this has a name. It's called legend tripping. With it now being privately owned, to cut down on trespassing, the owners put up a fence topped with barbed wire. On October 10th, 1997, a group of 8 teenagers decided to go legend tripping at St. Anne's. They found an area of the fence that was easily pulled back and were able to enter the grounds. Tiptoeing around the retreat, anxiously awaiting an appearance of the lady in black, they are met by 3 men who have shotguns pointed at them. The men forced these kids into one of the cabins. They made them all kneel down on their knees in a line. They were tied together by their necks with rope and handcuffed, with plastic toy handcuffs. The men taunted them and threatened to kill them. One of the men even fired a shot above their heads. But eventually, after what felt like an eternity to the kids, the police showed up. The men actually called the sheriff themselves. They didn't think they were doing anything wrong, just protecting the property. And maybe that's how the sheriff saw it too, because they cited the teenagers for trespassing, but the men continued on with their watchman duties. What? They tied kids up by their necks, terrorizing them with death threats, and even fired a shot in their direction. But back to work we go. All they had to say was, "Hey, no trespassing, get out of here," or I'm sure they would have willingly waited inside for police without needing to be tied up. I mean, they know they weren't supposed to be there. They weren't there to vandalize. This is just the kind of crap that teenagers do. My coworker Ashley lives in Logan, and she said that she snuck into St. Anne's when she was in high school. So the watchmen go back to guarding the retreat. It was apparently a good night for legend tripping because soon 30 more teens entered the grounds. Once again, the men threatened them with their shotguns. They forced this group into the empty swimming pool. Just like the last group, they tied them all together by their necks using rope. But in addition to that, they used zip ties to bound their wrists and their ankles. Then more zip ties attaching their ankles to their wrists, leaving them hogtied. The men told them that if they moved and the ropes tightened, it would trigger an explosion that would kill them all. They were kept there in the pool for over 2 hours. Can you imagine experiencing this as a teen? I would quite literally be pissing my pants. The men called the sheriff's office again. The dispatcher couldn't believe what she was hearing. You have them on their knees in a swimming pool with ropes around their neck? At gunpoint? Like, it does sound crazy. The man responded with, "Hey, this is private property," as if they had every right to do this. The 30 teenagers were hauled off to the sheriff's office and cited. In the eyes of the police, these 3 men were heroes for protecting the land. Luckily, the parents of these kids pressed charges and the judge saw it differently. These 3 men were named John Jepson, Christopher Dorr, and Arthur Peasnell. They were charged with 6 counts of aggravated assault. There was a charge of sexual assault where one of the men groped a girl's breasts while tying her up, but for some reason that charge was dropped. All 3 men did serve a few months in prison over the ordeal. The trespassing charges on all 38 teens were dropped. Perhaps they had endured enough punishment. They were probably traumatized for life. The story of St. Anne's Retreat may sound familiar to you if you watch Travel Channel's Ghost Adventures. It was featured in Season 12, Episode 9. It made me laugh because they were freaking out on the way up because the GPS stopped working. Like, there's no service. Welcome to the Cache National Forest. The host, Zach Bagans, brought a psychic medium to evaluate the paranormal presence. As soon as she stepped foot on the grounds, she stopped in her tracks and started shouting the number 3 over and over. She stated the number 3 had significance. She said she felt the presence of 3 people around her. The haunted cabin where the first group of teens were held was cabin number 3. The number of men that terrorized the kids in 1997? 3. Previously, another paranormal investigator received 3 red scratches on his body while in cabin number 3. The medium says that there is a male dark force on the grounds that she feels was conjured up during a satanic ritual. Now, as much as I enjoy a good ghost story, I think Ghost Adventures tends to exaggerate the experiences. I didn't think much happened in this episode outside of the normal batteries draining from the equipment and a weird feeling in a certain room kind of thing. I do think at one point Zach had a thermal camera pointed at an open door to the pool house. It was green, meaning nothing there. It was cool. And then all of a sudden the inside filled red, and then a few seconds later it was back to green. So something was in the pool house. One thing I took away from that episode that is pertinent to my story is that Zach Bagans interviewed a few of the people that were held hostage by the armed guards in 1997. Wyatt and Brianne were 2 of the initial 8 teenagers that snuck into St. Anne's. Wyatt tells Zach Bagans that he saw the Hellhound. He didn't know what it was at the time, he just remembered the red eyes. But as I mentioned earlier, it's an omen that bad things are going to happen. He must have gotten the full St. Anne's experience that night. After seeing the Hellhound, they heard a baby crying. The group walked over to the pool where they saw the lady in black standing at the edge staring down into the empty pool. Zach Bagans interviewed another witness from that night, Tito. Tito said there was one older man who definitely seemed in charge and the other 2 men were just following along. When the old man was tying his wrists and ankles with zip ties, he made them way too tight and it was hurting. Tito was making noises as if he was in pain, and a friend down the line called out to leave him alone. The man stepped away from Tito and walked over to the friend who spoke up. He put the gun to his head and pulled the trigger. Tito thought for sure his friend had just been killed, but the gun was fired above his head. How incredibly cruel these men were to these kids. Once they were moved inside the cabin, Tito said the man asked why they came up here. He responded with, quote, "To see if the legend is true, if there really is evil up here." According to Tito, the man said that anyone who has died at the retreat was by his hands and he buried them there under the cabin. I'm sure he was just saying that to scare them. But Brianne said the ringleader had this crazed look in his eye, like he was possessed by something dark. Now, I think this might be pushing it too far. I wasn't there, so I can't vouch for what they saw that night. But I'm pretty sure this was a group of men that grossly misunderstood their job as watchmen and took it upon themselves to capture and terrorize these kids. I can understand them having shotguns and just using them as a scare tactic to chase kids away, but they definitely took it too far by holding them hostage for hours until deciding to call law enforcement. For some reason, Tito returned to the nunnery when he was in college with a few fraternity brothers. He said he didn't want to enter, they just walked up to the fence. His friends saw 3 dark figures running down the hill towards them, so the boys took off running back to their car. 3. Just like the psychic medium said, she felt the presence of 3 spirits around her. St. Anne's has changed ownership again. The new owner, Matt Nielsen, plans on restoring the cabins and opening it back up to the public again. But I would avoid going up there during the renovations because it could come with a $750 fine and up to 3 months in jail. My coworker that I mentioned earlier said she actually knows the owners, and they recently had a private outdoor horror movie screening up there. Sounds like the perfect place to do it. Once it opens back up, my husband really wants to go up and stay overnight and camp there, but I don't know, I feel like I'm too much of a wussy. I can talk true crime all day long, but paranormal stuff for some reason freaks me out. Like, I can't watch it before bed. St. Anne's is known as one of the most haunted places in Utah, but far from the only spot. Ghost Adventures has actually visited Kay's Cross, which is like down the street from my house, and the Fear Factory in Salt Lake City. I'm curious to know if any of my listeners have visited the retreat and had any experiences. Please get on my social media or email me. I want to know if you saw the lady in black. Tell me your stories. You guys have been showing me so much love, and I really, really appreciate it. The best way to help is to share killer stories with your true crime friends, but also get on Apple Podcasts and leave me a 5-star review. It really helps with visibility of my podcast. All of the sources for today's episode can be found on the show notes. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Killer Stories Podcast. My email is killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. I want to share a trailer of this new podcast I'm obsessed with. If you guys love true crime, you love killer stories, you're going to love Ivy League Murders.
Welcome to Ivy League Murders. The Ivy League. They are the 8 most prestigious colleges in the nation. And as we've seen recently, people will do or pay anything to get their kids into them. When you hear Ivy League, what comes to mind? Is it the hallowed halls of education and tradition? Professors in tweed coats pontificating about Walt Whitman? Elitism? Finals clubs? What you probably don't think of is murder. On this podcast, we focus on cases affiliated with the Ivy League, exploring the darker side of higher education. What happens when genius becomes evil? We deep dive into the stories behind the picture-perfect Ivy Leaguers who appear to have everything and throw it all away. And for what? Love? Money? Obsession? My name is Sarah Alcorn. I'm a Harvard graduate, and I've been a private investigator since 1999. Join me and longtime crime diva Laura McDonald for Ivy League Murders.
I hope you enjoyed this week's kickoff to the spooky season. Until next time, this has been a killer story.